What is up, everyone? Welcome into another edition of our NBA DFS DraftKings Picks videos, this time for Friday, December 10th. I'm your host, Justin Bales. We have a larger 9-game slate after a 3-gamer last night. The NBA was kind of doing this weird thing where Monday, Wednesday, Friday, all really big slates. Tuesday, Thursday, only 3-game slates. We all, I think, would probably rather be back to the every kind of day is between 5 and 9 games. That would be much better. But we kind of give what they take, and we do have 9 games tonight, so a lot to break down. If you enjoy this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. You can turn on the notifications so you don't miss any of our podcasts that we post. Also, you can drop any comments you have below. I will answer any questions that you have about the slate throughout the day. You can also find all of our stuff at dfskarma.com. Free content, premium content, all the links that you could possibly need, including to our Discord chat, are in the description below. So just click the little show more and you will find all of the links there. I think we can get into the injury news. We have quite a bit, as is generally the case with a 9-game slate. But Rashawn Holmes has been ruled out for Sacramento. He's going to miss some time. On the other side of that game, Mason Plumlee, Ish Smith, Jalen McDaniels, Terry Rozier, and LaMelo Ball all out for at least 2 more games, I believe. Willie Cauley-Stein out for Dallas. Sterling Brown questionable. Justin Holiday on the other side is out for Indiana. OG Anunoby will continue to miss time, as will Khem Birch. Precious Achiuwa is also questionable for tonight's game. Killian Hayes and Hamidou Diallo both are back in and starting for Detroit. Patrick Beverley is probable to play for Minnesota. D'Angelo Russell still questionable. Semi Ojeleye, Dante DiVincenzo, both out for a few more games. George Hill questionable to play tonight for Houston. Daniel House, Jalen Green, and Kevin Porter all have already been ruled out. Jaylen Brown, Bruno Fernando, both out for Boston, whereas Devin Booker will miss, I believe, at least 2 more games for the Phoenix Suns. That about does it. There's actually not that much news in terms of questionable players, which is kind of nice, but I'm sure more are going to pop up throughout the day. That's just generally what happens with these bigger slates. But we do still have some key news that we're waiting on, specifically D'Angelo Russell, Precious Achiuwa. Both of those are relatively big names that could change the scape of this slate. But getting into the position by position, I'm going to try to keep essentially the amount of players that I'm going to pick relatively brief, relatively low. Still outline, a few guys at each position that I do like, different pricing ranges. But if there's anyone that you have any questions on, go ahead, drop their name in the comments. I will let you know how I feel about them throughout the day as soon as I can. Starting at point guard, I think the first thing that I really want to do on this slate, it's tough because I do really like Trae Young, but Shai Gilgeous-Alexander just feels too cheap. He's really safe at only 8,200. It gets a good matchup against the Lakers, who really struggle against scoring point guards. Obviously, that's exactly what Gilgeous-Alexander is. He's performed well against the Lakers in both matchups, averaging 46.5 fantasy points per game against them. And he's been slightly better at home throughout the season. So 8,200, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander just feels like a really, really safe option. I guess they're not that close in price tag. So I will also outline Trae Young. He's been on fire over the last 10 days. He's averaging 56.2 fantasy points per game. Gets a plus matchup against the Brooklyn Nets, who he already played well against. Not well enough to pay off a 10K price tag, but as is generally the case with a lot of players in the NFL, specifically scorers, when they start playing well, they kind of keep going. They get in their groove, and then their upside kind of increases significantly more than when they're in the shooting drought. And Trae Young is really playing well. Price tag actually dropped from his last game for this one. So I do think that he's a very good option at his current price. As you shift down a little bit more, it's tough because there's not that many guys in the mid price. I think with Jaylen Brown being out, the more or less obvious one becomes Dennis Schroeder. 6,500 is still a bit too cheap. I know that price actually is getting relatively high, but he's starting playing massive minutes and a big role in the offense with Jaylen Brown out. So I do think that Schroeder makes a lot of sense, even though I don't necessarily like the matchup against Phoenix tonight. It's just kind of an instance where the price tag matches, what he's going to do. So I do like that. Devonte Graham at 5,000, just too cheap for essentially a very talented guard. We do know that he's talented. He played well for Charlotte prior to going to New Orleans. Doesn't necessarily have the massive role there or anything, but 38 minutes in his last game, 34 before that. He's played 30 minutes in 5 consecutive games. I mean, it's tough not to like him at only 5,000 because we do know that he comes with 30 plus fantasy point upside, even if he really hasn't flashed it all that much recently. So I will take a shot on him more in tournaments, I would say, than cash games. But I do think that he is pretty viable. And then if you want to go all the way down, Armani Brooks at 4K. I don't necessarily know that I trust him, but with multiple players out for Houston, he did play 29 minutes in their last game. He scored 30 fantasy points. We've seen him earlier where he played 30 minutes and scored 30 fantasy points. He does come with plenty of upside. The 4K price tag is really appealing. That's more or less the reason that I would be looking at him. If he came with a significantly higher price tag, I wouldn't really be overly interested in him. But for 4,000, I do think that you can take a shot there. Moving to shooting guard, this position's kind of iffy because you have obviously D'Angelo Russell up at 9K, where you're just more or less waiting to hear whether he's going to play. I think the guy that sticks out more towards the top would be Kelly Oubre. His price is all the way up to almost 8,000. He's 7,800 tonight. The big thing is, though, he gets the matchup against the Sacramento Kings in his last 2 games where Charlotte's been dealing with a ton of injuries. He's played 41 and 43 minutes, 44 and 58 fantasy points in those games. He's taking over 20 shots a game. He's taking a ton of threes. We already know that Sacramento isn't really an overly dominant defense. So I do really like this game. And Kelly Oubre is probably the leader at the moment for the Charlotte Hornets. So I think that he's one of the better options, even though we're not really getting him at a lower price tag at this point in the season. As you move down, Tyrese Halliburton is playing really, really well. He's playing with the ball in his hands more, and he's locked into massive minutes, 37 plus in each of his last 3. Over that span, 51, 39, and 32 fantasy points. He has 27 assists in the 3 games, averaging 9 a game. He has doubled in 2 of those games. We kind of know that he's not the type of player that's really going to completely take over the offense. But as he plays with the ball in his hands more, it kind of just increases his ceiling as he can come with double upside. He does get more assists in these types of games. And obviously the matchup against Charlotte, who is really reeling from the COVID that they're dealing with, and they don't really have all that much that they can put out on the floor right now. I do think that Halliburton is a really good option. A little bit below him, I do want to mention Cody Martin. Similar to Kelly Oubre, he's priced up. He's still only 5,700 though. He's not really taking over the offense or anything of the sort, but he's a guard that gets a matchup against Sacramento. We know obviously they struggle in that type of a situation. He also has played 40 plus minutes in each of his last 2 games. So he will be on the court plenty. He does come with solid upside. I have really no issues whatsoever. If anyone wants to use him, I do slightly prefer Halliburton. I think Martin might be slightly safer, I guess, at the moment, but I do slightly prefer Halliburton. I think that both of them make really good options, and I'm not sure how many lower priced options I really want to consider at shooting guard. I do think that there are some other plays that you can use here. One that sticks out a little bit at 4,400 is Garrison Matthews. Locked into big minutes for Houston. He's more or less a sharpshooter. Depends quite a bit on scoring. I wouldn't say solely because he can add blocks and steals, and he did have one game where he had 11 rebounds. That's just more of an outlier. But he can really rack up the steals at times. Locked into big minutes. As I said, a sharpshooter, which is kind of questionable against Milwaukee. The thing is, he's only 4,400, so it's not like you need all that much to happen or all that much to go right for him. And I do think that he's at least viable, even if it's just in tournaments on this type of a slate. And then as you move down, Terrence Davis, for the time being, is playing bigger minutes. I don't necessarily know what their plan is. I believe Harrison Barnes is expected to return tonight. With him playing, I assume that those minutes probably get taken away from Terrence Davis. We kind of need to, or I guess I kind of need to look into that a little bit more. But even if he's going to play, 20 to 25 minutes, I think he's viable in this spot. 4,000 is just way too cheap for the type of games that he has been playing because he's been playing so well. And I don't necessarily know that they want to completely take him off the court. And they do have multiple different options that they can go just because of the way that Harrison Barnes can play either forward position. So kind of need to see what's happening with Terrence Davis here. But at 4,000, I do think that he is likely going to be in play for me. If you're using someone like Trae Young, it does make sense to bring it back with someone like Kevin Durant. The problem is Durant is extremely expensive. Not necessarily a guy that I love using because he's priced more towards not necessarily his ceiling, but more towards what's likely to happen versus where he actually has been sitting. With that being said, he performed extremely well against Atlanta earlier this season. I do think that he's viable once again. As you move down a little bit, you're probably going to end up debating Miles Bridges versus Gordon Hayward. I think if I'm choosing one of the two, I'm siding with Hayward. He can create his own shot a little bit better. He's a little bit smaller of a player, so could find time at the two, whereas Bridges won't move out of forward. And obviously, we know that Sacramento really struggles against guards. I don't necessarily love either of them. I think Hayward's a really, really good tournament option. Bridges, I might shy away from. He hasn't really benefited from, all of the guys missing because he had such a big role before, and it's been relatively difficult for him to kind of really create his own shot with defensives more or less keying in on him. So I think I prefer Gordon Hayward in this spot, but realistically, most of the Charlotte players, at least the bigger names, can at least be considered in this type of a slate. You can move down more. Gary Trent Jr. always comes with upside. He's a very interesting option, really reliant on scoring. So if his shot isn't falling, he doesn't really do all that much else. There are games where he can add some other stuff. It's just those are kind of few and far between. With that said, he dominated the New York Knicks in their only matchup this season, scored over 40 fantasy points. He's still 6,100. So as long as OG Anunoby is out, Gary Trent kind of still comes with a relatively solid role in the offense. He's going to be locked into big minutes, and his offensive role specifically in terms of shots is going to increase, obviously. So I do think that even though he's up at 6,100, he is at least viable in this type of a game. Kevin Huerter, I really struggle plugging him into my lineups. I don't know what it is about him. I feel like he's a solid player in the NBA, but I don't necessarily love him for fantasy. Really inconsistent. Still plenty of upside, though. I believe if only a couple games ago, he scored 28 real life points, 40 fantasy points. Gets the plus matchup against the Brooklyn Nets. So I do think that he is in play at that price. Similar price, RJ Barrett, they kind of called him out more or less, saying that they needed more from him. He responded with 47.75 fantasy points in 39 minutes against the Spurs. In the next game, he played 35 minutes, 26 fantasy points. So at only 5,100, I do think that RJ Barrett is someone that really, really makes sense on this type of a slate, as long as, they should be locking him into the minutes in the mid to high 30s. And a lot of the times with a talented player, even though Barrett hasn't been overly consistent throughout the season, with a talented player, you just kind of want them to get the minutes. And if that's the case, it does make a lot of sense to use someone like that. One guy that I'm interested in the situation, and I probably move back off of him a little bit with Cam Reddish returning, but Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot, He's 3,200. He's played 38 and 39 minutes in his last two games. He's looked good, 25 and 34 fantasy points. Bogdan Bogdanovic, we know, is out. Cam Reddish has also been out, and he's returning. So I don't necessarily know exactly where these minutes immediately go. But I do think that Luwawu Cabarro is an interesting option, I guess, to say the least, in tournaments. I don't necessarily trust that he's going to get the big minutes. I guess we need to kind of wait and see if he's starting. If he is, I think he'll make a great play. If he isn't, he comes with quite a bit of risk, but obviously a lot of upside for only $3,200 as well. Moving to power forward, I feel that there's a few options. I do like both of the Lakers guys, LeBron James and Anthony Davis. I do think that they can both perform well while on the court together. Neither one is over 10,000 at this point, and they both get a really good matchup against the Oklahoma City Thunder. So either of those two make really good plays. LeBron's been playing really well recently, and Anthony Davis has been one of the more consistent Lakers throughout the entire season. So I do think that both of them are in play in this type of a game. As you continue down a little bit more, there aren't too many options that I necessarily love. I do think like PJ Washington, as I said earlier, most of the Charlotte guys can just be used. I do think that he is in play. Harrison Barnes at 5,400. He played 30 minutes in his last game. That's weird. I guess that answered the Terrence Davis question. Davis played big minutes in their last game as well. So they can obviously play together. I'll need to check that out a little bit more before I lock that in. But Terrence Davis obviously just kind of skyrocketing at the moment, just a really good cheap play. But Harrison Barnes at 5,400 is kind of a stupid price tag. 30 minutes in his last game. I'm assuming they expected him kind of to come in with some type of restriction. That wasn't really the case. He scored 30 fantasy points. He's been really good throughout the entire season. And as long as he's really under 6,000, especially in a good matchup against a team like Charlotte, I do think that Harrison Barnes should be more popular. Whether he actually becomes more popular, I'm not necessarily sure because people don't really love playing him. But I do think that he's a really good option, and he's someone that I at least will consider in cash games. There's not a ton that I love down at the bottom of power forward. It's just not really a great option. I don't think that this is a position that I necessarily go lower than Harrison Barnes. I don't really think that you have to. I think there are guys that can be considered. 200 below, Jared Vanderbilt. I have no problem with his upside. You have on the same team, Chimezie Metu. I think that he's relatively fine, but I don't play either of them above Harrison Barnes, and they're so close in terms of just price that it's not going to be difficult to get up to Barnes. So that's probably where I go if I'm going down at power forward tonight. At center, I still think that there's a bunch of different ways you can go here. I don't necessarily know if I'm paying up. If I am, it's likely Anthony Davis, who I already talked about. I do think that Karl Anthony Towns is fine, but Cleveland just really has a bunch of bigs that can slow down opposing centers, opposing power forwards. So I probably favor Anthony Davis there. I don't necessarily know what I want to do with any of the other high-priced guys. They're just not guys that I necessarily love. I do think that several of them come with plenty of upside. Christian Wood, Jonas Valanciunas, Pascal Siakam, Jarrett Allen, all of them come with the pure upside for their price tag that I do think you can take the shot on them. It's just that I don't necessarily love any of them at this point. I think that Bobby Portis is really interesting against Houston. I do like centers quite a bit against Houston, and Portis is only 7,100. So I have no real issues with that. Miles Turner obviously is going to stick out against Dallas. That definitely makes sense to me. Dallas is really bad against opposing centers. I think that with Domantas Sabonis playing some minutes at center as well, as they kind of stagger them, he is in play, but I much prefer the savings with someone like Miles Turner versus Sabonis, who's almost 10,000. There are a few other guys that are interesting, but I feel like you can just drop down. Um, you know, the Sacramento Charlotte game makes a ton of sense. Rashawn Holmes is out. Tristan Thompson's been playing around 20 minutes. He's played 20 between 20 and 22 minutes in 3 of his last 4. In those 3, he scored 25, 25, and 32. So 3,500, that's kind of an easy play. And then if Alex Len draws the start, I also think that he's in play here. It's just kind of waiting on the Sacramento news of what's going to happen with Rashawn Holmes out. But those are 2 really, really cheap options that are essentially in play. And then if Nick Richards draws the start again, he played 21 minutes in his last game. I don't think he's an overly safe play, but he does come with more or less enough upside. And if they're going to start someone like Alex Len, they could really use Nick Richards' size. So at 3,200, he's a viable, more or less tournament option at this point. But that breaks down the slate. That's quite a few plays to go over. Once again, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. You can comment anyone that you want to know my thoughts on below. I will definitely let you know them. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, everyone finds success tonight, and good luck.